I'm Josephine, Cloto, Marley, Wilson in parentheses, Beckwith. And I'm the daughter of Cloto May Johnson, Marley Baker, and Joseph Alexander Marley. I was born in East St. Louis, Illinois, March 22nd, 1915. And by the way, that little house is still there. I've gone back and taken the picture of it. 1824 Market Street. My father was an East St. Louisan, and my mother was an Altonian, having been born in the Wood Station area in Foster Township. In those days, there was a lot of interaction between people who lived in this area and the people who lived in East St. Louis and St. Louis. In some families, the young people who lived in Wood Station, Upper Alton, and so forth, went to high school in St. Louis and East St. Louis, and there were connections with families from those areas. And my father lived in East St. Louis. He was born in Danville, Illinois. His father was a minister and an AME minister, and was transferred to Belleville, Illinois, when my father was very young. I think he must have been like 6 or 7. I'm not sure. So, for all intents and purposes, Belleville was home for him. He grew up there. His father died when he was quite young, 12 or 13. So it was necessary for him to help his mother, to take care of the family. And he worked, well, I'll say horticulturist. Of course, he wasn't trained, but that was what he did. And gardening and raising flowers and so on and so forth, for well-to-do families in the area. And his mother was a beautician. She went into the homes of the wealthy people and took care of their hair. And that's how they lived. And I would have to verify this, but he was the first graduate from the Belleville High School who was of black heritage, African American, and he happened to be the valedictorian of that class. And then in those days, teachers, and it hasn't been too many years or decades since teachers went to Illinois State Normal or similar universities for 2 years to qualify as a teacher. And so that was the case. And he went to Illinois State Normal, although the African American students could not be on campus. They had to live out in the community. And there were people in their community that kept students who, the black students who were going to school at that time. The senior, Reverend Brewer, who was, they were classmates or schoolmates, and they lived in the same house in Normal. And I thought that was interesting. And Joseph Brewer was named Joseph. That they were all friends, Joe's mother and father, and my father were all friends. Dr. Mac Davis's uncle, and his name was Davis, and he was also a friend of my father's, and and they were all together at Illinois State Normal back in the olden days. So that it was very interesting to me when he came to visit once, many years ago, but when he came to visit us once, I thought that was so interesting. My father had one sister, and her name was Nina Marley. I'm trying to remember her husband's name. His last name was Cole, and he was a pastor at one time of Allen Chapel. And when I was, I guess I was 2 years old, I can barely remember, but I remember visiting, and some of the people who became my step relatives would take care of me when I was here in Alton with my aunt and uncle, who was the minister at the church that I later did belong to. She had 6 children. Now, we have not kept in contact. I tried desperately to do so, but their name is Cole. I took my children, their father and I, took them to visit wherever they were for 3 times, I guess. Omaha, Nebraska. They lived in Omaha, Nebraska. And then my aunt, as she got older, she moved to California, where several of her children lived, and we visited them there. That's on my Marley side. However, on the Johnson side, there's a lot of contact, and the Ballingers. My grandfather, William Johnson, was citizen of the Alton area, Wood Station, and he was one of the founders of what we know of today, and we're so proud of in Wood Station. And he's a person whose legacy still lives in that his grandson, Lloyd Johnson, has been fortunate enough to purchase and live on this family farm where so many people were born, so many people in our family were born and reared. It's sort of a homecoming not only for relatives, but for family friends and for all of the generations that I know and that my mother has told me about. People have always come to that site to visit and to share in a manner that I don't know of happening anywhere else in the world almost. I'm sure it does happen to other families and other communities, because the people from St. Louis, for an instance, the pastor of Central Baptist Church, one of the largest churches in St. Louis, had his summer home that sort of adjoined our family's farm. That was Dr. Stevens, and he spent much of his spare time and his vacation time on that site, which meant that he and my grandfather formed a very close relationship. It was sort of like an extended family. Now, my grandfather and grandmother, my grandmother was Mary Ballinger Johnson, and Mary Eliza Johnson. So about the time that I was coming along, they were getting older, and the practice of the older families was to buy a townhouse, and they would come to town, meaning Alton, and sort of leave the farm or sell the farm to their children, which happened. That grandmother and grandfather moved to the townhouse on Humbert Street, where Mrs. Bowling now lives. And my uncle Cyrus Johnson bought the farm to raise his family on. Of course, he'd never been anyplace else. He was born there, so that was very natural. Okay, and grandmother and grandfather, oh, I guess they moved back and forth between the farm and town, but the town was their headquarters. And they still brought some of the farm to the town. I remember, I remember when I was about, I guess, a lot happened between the time I was 6 and 8 years old. And they had, like some people buy sports cars for their children. Grandmother and grandfather had a special buggy and a real fancy horse, Gladys. I'll never forget Gladys. For my mother and her sister Grace, who is Jewel Smith's mother, they were divorcees living back at home, and the parents were being indulgent. And this was, for them, this was real special, having Gladys, the fancy buggy. They had buggies of different descriptions. I remember when we were all out in Wood Station, there was a Sunday buggy that we went to Sunday school in. And it had all these fringes and things, you know, like storybook, just like the stories, you know. And, and then they had grandmother, when she came to town just before, I can't really truthfully divide this. I guess this was an interim period, because I remember I had just come into the family from East St. Louis, and grandmother would bring me to town in this buggy, her town buggy. I'm not quite sure on the exact time frame, but I remember doing that, and she'd stop along the road near her, the road where she was born, there near Wood Station. And as you came up the hill, there were sassafras trees, and this was a big treat. And we children, grandmother would stop, and we would pick the sassafras leaves and chew them up like you do chewing gum. And that was just so special. And I came from East St. Louis, from, you know, the streets. And, you know, all of that kind of activity was so novel to me. It was so novel to me. And the other kids just took it for granted. You know, this is what you're supposed to do, you know. But for me, it was very different, because I lived these two lives because my parents were divorced when I was about 3 years old. And I lived in East St. Louis with my father and my sister, who was born during this period of time. I'm deviating again, because of the unrest in East St. Louis, and the riot that had done so much damage, and the danger. My mother had come up here with us, not with us, Naomi. She was pregnant with Naomi. And so my parents were never enemies. It was just that neither one of them liked living in the other one's community. And my father had to earn a living. He taught school in East St. Louis, because he couldn't, you know, because of his color, he couldn't teach in Belleville. So he couldn't leave. He didn't feel that he could leave because conditions up here were as bad or worse. So mother, she came back to her mom and daddy. And so that's how, when you hear me talking, you know, it's kind of schizo. We had to walk, which kids in Wood Station took for granted. And They have nice now woodlands, golf course, and everything is out there on part of that land and all of those kinds of nice things. And the highways and the roads are nice now. But right there at that juncture, I'm not exaggerating. Dust was that thick. It was like walking through snow, the dust in the roads. And that would make you feel so dirty. You felt so dirty. And the country kids, they just, it was okay with them. And I couldn't understand, how could they stand all this dirt? And when we went to church, to Salem Baptist Church, we go to Sunday school, and if we go to Sunday school, and grandmother, who was a Sunday school teacher, whether she was in town or not at that point, and Uncle Cyrus and Aunt Cornelia, his wife, if they weren't going to church at the same time, then we walked to church. There again, we'd have to carry shoes. In the summer, you'd have to carry your shoes because you had to walk through all of this dust. I've never seen dust like Wood Station dust anywhere. And but that we'd have fun, kicking through it and everything. But I would just feel so dirty, and I knew I had to adjust to this lifestyle, and nobody else ever complained of being dirty, so I knew not to do that. But so then when my mother, jumping back, I guess, later from St. Louis when we came, and my mother married Clinton Everett Baker, then I was in the second grade. I had come to visit my mother in Altamont, and when my father came to get me, somehow my parents agreed that I could stay with my mother, and that was then when Grandpa Ellis died. Then Mother came back to the Wood Station area, and that's the area, the period of time that I was talking about so far as the school and walking through the dust is concerned. And it is so interesting. I keep going back. Every time I go to eat at Woodlands Golf Course or in that area, there's another business around the corner there. I think about those days that we were walking to school past that, and how the land was not, it was farmland, and how the difference in that time has brought. That leads me up to other differences here in town too. But when Mother married Daddy Baker, I was in the second grade, or entering the second grade at Dunbar School. That school was in Upper Alton on Washington Avenue at the corner of Washington Slough and Powhatan. Slough on one end, Powhatan on the other, which has been destroyed following the unification of the students due to desegregation. So the black schools were eliminated. I don't know how else to put it, but that's the way it was. That was a school that had nationally later. The PTA had done some research and so forth, but from the Dunbar School in Alton, and also the Dunbar School in East St. Louis, those two schools are noted for having developed the students at those two schools. The percentage of people who you don't like to, well, you've done well, one way or the other. They've made good citizens professionally or however. But that, and Mrs. Daisy, we know her as Daisy Fair Cox. When she taught so many years, she was the principal. She became the principal. She became the principal of that school. And she knows and can tell you about the high percentage of successful people who came out of that school. I can tell you about the other side of that school too. And you know, they say kids are so bad now. But those kids were bad. Some of them. Now the difference is, I think, that in today's world we've got complications of alcohol and drugs, where children, if they're not directly exposed, themselves, their parents oftentimes are young and exposed and so forth. So the nature of the badness may be different, but the degree, to me, in Alton, Illinois, the degree, because these kids, they were seemingly, there was more of a spirit of, jealousy among students. Then maybe I'm just out of the picture, but I know it seems to me, even with my middle-aged and older people who came through the school system, and I did have 5 of them come through, seems like they didn't have to buck that as much as we did. Like, for instance, it was very bad times, so people who were poor were dreadfully poor, unlike what we consider poor now, because there was no recourse. And so they seemed, especially in Alton, they seemed to always have a chip on their shoulder toward their equals, oftentimes. Not always. And I don't know whether I should tell this or not, but I tell it because I'm holding up for children who are trying to do right now. Because naughty conduct is not new. It really isn't new. And it has been going on. And in small communities like ours, the lack of opportunities for development by parents can't make a living on the level they're capable of. And this has been true, and it's still true, because, most of them have to leave town to really achieve even yet. This is true in the African American community. But people stay sort of uptight, and the children were, the other kids, if they were a little smarter or whatever, it seems like there was that spirit, a little spirit of jealousy that I'm not sure I have, that it's as bad now as it was then. I just don't think so, from what I have observed. But in my day it was, and I was an outsider. And our community that I love so dearly and I've stayed in, we are known, not to really, there's something about us that we don't like new things, we don't like outsiders too much. These families interrelated here in Alton as well as in St. Louis. For instance, there have been times when my mother and Dr. Stevens' daughter, who was the mother of Henry Rhetta, who also lives now in Wood Station, were best friends. And so, as happens in the world today, when my mother and father were divorced, then my mother lived in St. Louis part-time with that family. And I started school under those circumstances in St. Louis, living with the Stevens and the Rhetta family. Of course, in these times, you know, people very seldom have to do that. They don't. And they very seldom have that kind of relationship. But out in Wood Station in Foster Township, the families out there did have a sort of an extended family relationship where they really shared. And it wasn't just really limited to the African American citizens out there, because there was an unusual relationship between all of the farmers out there. I remember when we were children how they helped bring babies in the world, you know, regardless of their colors and so forth. And when it was time for reaping and so on and so forth, and I think Lloyd and Cyrus probably still have similar relationships with their neighbors. But the neighbors, all of the neighbors came together, and I remember as a little kid, you know, what a wonderful time it was, because all of the women of the neighborhood, no matter what color they were or what status or anything else, gathered and prepared all of these storybook kinds of meals while the men reaped and so forth. And that may be something that has happened recent enough for the younger members of the family to remember. So that was always very pleasant times, you know. We children always had chores. We always had chores. In our family, there was no such thing. There was no such thing as just being a kid and being out of the picture. You were always in the middle of the picture having something to do. That even included, when we were little kids, picking gooseberries and blackberries. This is Johnson-related experiences. We'd pick gooseberries and blackberries, and I remember them because they stick. That's the reason that stands out. I mean, but we were picking them for sale, and there was a train. And I like to mention this because nobody seems to remember or consider this anymore. But there was a train station, the reason it was called Wood Station, at the foot of the hill where our great-grandparents lived. And there at that junction, this train came every morning at 8 o'clock, every afternoon at 4 o'clock. And all of the farm activities seemed to, in my childish mind, seemed to center around getting milk and fruit and whatever packed, you know, in these big things that we had to put it in, you know. The men had to, and the older boys and all, they had to have the milk all ready, you know, that was their chore and all. But we little people, we were picking berries and all this kind of stuff to get ready so that the men would take it down to meet the train twice a day with whatever, peaches. Now, since almost anything you could mention, really, that grows. Later years, when my mother remarried and we lived here in town, then we'd go out and help with the picking of the fruit and so forth. And my mother would sell the peaches that were not good enough, first class. They call them culls. And so even if they had the slightest blemish, they could not go in with the good fruit. So my mother would sell the culls on Saturday here in town at reduced prices. But since that time, a giant fire, eliminated the orchards. my parents lived separately as a result of the experiences of the riot that was in East St. Louis it was a racial riot, and it had been developing for some time. But there were, and this has to be verified, and I'm speaking of what I have read and heard because I was too young to really experience, but there were just hundreds and hundreds of black people who were killed. Just by the hundreds they were killed. And there were, I don't know, I think in the teens of Caucasian people who were killed. Anyway, it was a terrible historical riot, a racial riot in East St. Louis. And of course, living through those kinds of experiences affected families and so forth. This happened, I think historically, the year is 1917, and that meant I was only 2 years old. So I just remember just like dots of memory. I do remember my father having me in my arms and looking out of this window that, looking back, it seems like we were in a basement looking out of a window, sort of huddled up. And I just remember that. I remember another little vignette that was so horrible. And that was of, I spent a lifetime trying not to remember these things now. A man on a motorcycle, and it must have been a shot, but I'm a child. But this man being killed on this motorcycle. Now, parents are trying to shield you from seeing these things, so you're seeing just snatches and so I can't elaborate because I don't know, and my parents worked so hard at my not knowing until I really can't first person explain too much about that riot, except that riot played such a part in my family history, in that my parents were not mad at each other. They just simply could not. My father could not leave his occupation as a teacher there in East St. Louis because he could not teach in his home in Belleville because of his racial background. And my mother didn't feel like she could put up with the unrest that resulted from the riot, that was created by the riot. So she came up here back to her parents' farm to have her second child, my sister Naomi, who is now Naomi Marley Maxwell, living in Laurel, Maryland. And so just time kept them apart, and interest in their own communities and so forth. And they were divorced. So people think some of these things are new, but I have spent my first 6 years with my father, my second 6 years with my mother, my third 6 years with my father. So people think this kind of shared parenthood is something new, but it's something that my sister and I grew up with, and we were on this, they had these old-fashioned streetcars. We call them old-fashioned now, they were not then, that ran between these cities. So every month we came back to visit my mother. And that's one reason some people think I have, for instance, been here all the time, but I really haven't. Except I have it all in my adult life, but as a growing up child, I really didn't. But we visited my mother so often, you see, until we were familiar, and everybody, folks out on the farm and the school kids and everybody, because sometimes our schools would not start at the same time, so we'd visit with our friends and relatives here in Alton before we'd go home to go to school. And sometimes we'd take in later years, we'd take after my mother remarried and all, the kids got old enough, we'd take our half-sister especially, and brother, take them back. They'd we'd take them to school with us, and my daddy'd buy them outfits and things, and then and so that's the way we grew up. You know, it's I guess for some people it was unusual, but that was just our lifestyle. That we had these two parents that we loved, and they were nice enough and thoughtful enough to train us to love each other, you know, to love both families. So that's the way we were reared, running back and forth. And I was at home in East St. Louis. Naomi was at home here, primarily, you know, in our hearts, I'm saying, because I had such positive experiences in East St. Louis, as far as people are concerned. And then, you know, being the only kid, you know, for a long time down there, and the neighbors and the school. I've been going to school all of my life. My dad took me to school with him to work, and I would sit in I'd sit in the kindergarten classes, or I really would decide where I was going to be. Isn't that awful? But they let me do it. I don't ever remember starting to school. So far as school is concerned, see, I've gone to so many schools, it's hard for me to put them in chronological order. I started school formally in the first grade in St. Louis after going to kindergarten classes and so forth as a baby child almost in East St. Louis. It was not many months. It seems longer than it was. It was a very short time. I liked St. Louis, and I liked what was happening. We lived with the teachers who were involved in the school system, and my mother played for Central Baptist Church, so there was a lot of activity around the church at that age. But then she came back to Wood Station here in Alton area. I went to East St. Louis, 12 years old, in the 6th grade. I finished school 6 years later, you know, I'm 18. And I did not have one instance, one experience in school that would compare with any of dozens that I had when I was in Alton. It was not comfortable. It wasn't comfortable. And when I was kind of a basket case, I guess, when I first went to East St. Louis, at recess time, I'd get a book out on the playground. I'd back up against the school, and I'd get this book because I knew somebody was going to pick at me. Somebody was going to pull my hair or make fun of me. You know, I was so self-conscious. And I'll never forget one day, and a kid ran up. She ran up to me and grabbed my hand. I was standing up against the wall. I'm so busy reading, you know. And she grabbed my hand and said, come on, Josephine, let's, and I don't know something about playing, you know. I was scared to death. I thought she was grabbing me to do something negative to me. I had been so accustomed to kids picking on me up here at Dunbar School. So I never experienced a negative experience at all. And all of the years I went to school in East St. Louis, not once. The way the kids would do, bad kids down there, they'd say, if they were saying bad words or something, back in my time now, or talking about what had happened last night, or something like that, and then you and your gang would be behind them or coming around or something. They'd say, here it comes, here, you know, they'd put their hand over their mouth. They'd make a big deal like kids do. But they weren't mad at you. They didn't, you know, you were all right. They just didn't want to include you in their conversation, and they had the attitude, you're not supposed to know what we know. You know, that was the only kinds of things that I ever experienced. I never experienced anything. And in high school, it was just delightful. It was delightful at Dunbar School. But except my father taught there when I was there. My dad was the 8th grade teacher. And so I called him Mr. Marley, you know, we kept it very separate. And but boy, were they tough at that school. You had to do college work to get out. You had to do college work. My father taught us, Naomi and I, you do not need domestic science to be a good woman. He would add, you get enough of that when you visit your mother. He did add that, I'll admit that. They were friends, but that was something he didn't like. Because naturally we had to help take care of the little kids and you know, to do everything, you know, the Johnson way. Okay, but he didn't believe in girls working. The black students had to walk across town to take domestic science and what they call manual training, manual arts. The boys took manual arts, but you had to walk all the way across town on Thursday afternoon to take these classes. Well, everybody liked it, you know, because you're getting out of school, walk across town, you know, having a good time. And I'm looking forward to that. And I was in my father's classroom. This happened in the 8th grade, see. And Papa would not allow me to go. And what I know now, he put his job on the line. Because I had to sit in class. He sent to University of Illinois and got stuff for me to study. And all the other girls were gone. And the boys were gone. They went to different centers. And here I am, and I mean, my father was not a stern father, but in the classroom, he was awful. Here he was cracking the whip, and I felt so neglected and so, but I thank him every day. I thank him every day. He knew. So I have never had 1 hour of domestic science. And my dad could have lost his job. And I've learned a lot about it later, that he was resisting these, not having a domestic science program at the Dunbar School or whatever, but this happened at Dunbar School, so that the students, you know, didn't have to walk across town. And there was one that was not going to walk across town, and she didn't. But of course, I didn't know all of this was going on behind my back or anything, you know. I didn't know anything. And I didn't need domestic science because I married right out when I finished high school. Going out to Wood Station to visit a very domestic area, which was so much fun and so much to learn with my Uncle Cyrus's wife, Jenny Cornelia. I call her Aunt Cornelia, but her name was Jenny. And my grandmother, who had cracked the whip with us so far as domestic things were concerned. Then, you know, my father was right, you know, with your natural inclinations. So I love domestic things, and when I just used the magazines and the example. And then later, when I married, my mother-in-law, Mrs. Wilson, Lenora, I just loved her so. Oh, I did love that lady. And everything that she did, she brought the Southern way of doing things to my knowledge. And I learned new things, and the food and how to do things the way they did in the South, that I just loved learning from her. And I could put that together with grandmother and mother and her, because my dad, he did the chores that we were supposed to do, because he said studying is your job. And so if you had a book, you didn't have to do anything but breathe. Just breathe in that book. And Pop, on Saturdays, he did our washing. I don't ever remember washing a thing growing up, not one item. But here, I was so accustomed to doing just drudgery, because my mother had 4 little kids, and we had to pitch in. And I'm used to all of this stuff, and I felt like I should be doing something. So one morning, I got up. I've done this twice. Once gardening, because he didn't allow girls to garden, and he had the most beautiful gardens, and he raised roses and I just wanted to get into that dirt. I'm used to, boy, when it rained, you had to get out there and pull weeds while the ground was soft here, And so I missed that. And so anyway, I want to tell you about this morning. This morning, I got up very early. My dad got up early. He got up early, and he read the Globe Democrat. And then this is every single day but Sunday, I guess. Then he had his boy students to come to the house every morning. And they trotted around the blocks. And he stopped and bought goodies for our breakfast, rolls and junk we didn't need. But anyway, it was just his way of doing every single day. So I'm going to beat him to it. If he didn't bring the stuff back with him, then he cooked cream of wheat and so forth. My stepmother didn't do it, he did it. Okay, this Saturday morning, I got up 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm going to make biscuits. I had seen my mother make biscuits, and my stepmother, as far as that's concerned. So I made these biscuits, and I cooked some cream of wheat. That was it. But anyway, because my dad was a great bacon eater, but I didn't cook any bacon. Anyway, so I'm cooking breakfast. All right, so when they all woke up, I had breakfast ready. And I had the fruit all chopped up, like we usually did every morning. And I set the table, and I was feeling so proud of myself. When they got ready to eat these biscuits, I didn't know you're supposed to put shortening in the biscuits. And so you can imagine what they were like, just hard as rocks. Oh, my father teased me about that for years. I don't think, he never did stop. He never stopped teasing me. And you know what Papa did? He took one of those biscuits and went outdoors and threw the biscuit up the side. He was always clowning with us, He really made a big deal out of those biscuits. Another time I was going to be very homey, and I got up early in the morning to pull weeds out of the flower beds. And the roses, the things, and I was just I was all scratched up. And every time Papa would look at a scratch, he would tease me, because that wasn't what he wanted me to do anyway, The teachers at Lincoln School, when I went to high school, the teachers were so helpful in so many ways outside of the academics. They made sure you had exposure to music, you know, to operatic exposures in those days when they'd have operatic activities in St. Louis, because see, we were just across the river. And African Americans, it's hard for me to get those words out when I'm talking about these kind of horrible things, could not go. But what they would do, they would bring some of the performers, I guess, who were sympathetic to us. I don't really know that. And they would do the opera there at Lincoln High School. And then we would do the opera. We had the world champion typewriter. The only reason they keep us out was because of color, because we would take everything, academic and music. We take it. I belonged to Champion Latin. We were a Champion Latin group. But it left positive, the discrimination wasn't as acute as it is as an adult for those experiencing, because we achieved so much and we knew we were the best. We knew we were the smartest kids going. We knew we sang the best. We knew we could operate that typewriter better than anybody else. We knew that. And so being limited not to be able to compete beyond a certain point in Illinois, and then, you know, it was still limited. But it didn't affect us. Isn't that strange? And that's the reason kids, I think, from my generation, who went, if you know adults who went to these segregated school systems, who have achieved so much, and those that you associate with in your national activities. I'm talking about over and above just having a good job. I mean, the real people who achieve are usually people, often, who come from these kinds of backgrounds, because that's a very strange thing, that they were able to give to us this sense of worth and to expect from us the achievement that somehow that sense has been diminished. And we observe that the teachers nor the students, and I'm not blaming, it's the times. So many different things happen that may be considered unusual and yet not too different from what they are now, except people were not mad at each other. You know, I don't have that experience where segments of family or professions or whatever, I'm not exaggerating. I don't know whether I was shielded, but I really don't have that kind of memory. I have memories of, you know, grandmother being too strict. But she was strict on everybody, and I was the outsider. When they'd get mad at me, they'd call me Joe Marley. My mother did that. My grandmother did that. But wasn't that nice? And I would snicker. They thought they was calling me, they thought they was straightening me out, and that was the best thing they could ever say to me. They couldn't call me anything that I liked any better. And grandmother would say, "There you go, Joe Marley. Run." And she would be scolding, but I would consider it a compliment because he was the most wonderful person in the world. And I said, now, you know, grown-ups don't realize what's going on in children's minds, but that happened. I did enjoy the environment in St. Louis very much because it was a continuation of a lot of school activities and the addition of intense church activities in that Mother played the piano for Central Baptist Church in St. Louis. Dr. Stevens, who was our family friend, my grandfather's dear, dear friend, was the pastor of that church at that time. And there was quite a bit of activity. Henry Rhetta's mother, Edith Rhetta, and her sister, Felicia Alexander. They were all younger women. Felicia was engaged to be married, and there wasn't a lot of activity around when we little girls. Felicia, who was the daughter of the Rhettas, and I particularly, we really did enjoy all of the things that were happening at church and at home around Felicia Alexander's being engaged to be married to this wonderful gentleman, and how the family was reacting, and my mother's involvement, and so I really loved all of those things that were happening. But while we lived in St. Louis, Mother moved out to get her own apartment. As I'm saying this, am I remembering it? It was not alone. It was with her cousin, Blanche Ballinger, her first cousin, Blanche Ballinger, who lived in St. Louis, who was a singer, actress, fledgling kind of person. But she was in music circles. And I'm remembering a lot now. And so we lived in the apartment with cousin Blanche Ballinger. That also was a short time, but it seems to me like it was a long time. And that exposed me to more music people. And some of those people who are now thought of as, you hear the names. Those were the people that my mother and Blanche Ballinger were associated with. And that's how she met my stepfather, Clinton Baker. Not here in Alton. She did not know him in Alton at all. But in these music circles, because he played piano for a band, dance band, that Blanche Ballinger sang with. So that's how they met and were married in St. Louis. And that brought the change that brought, when she married Clinton Baker, that brought us back to Alton. But there was an interim period that I didn't mention along the way, where we lived out in Wood Station, on the family farm. Like grandmother and grandfather left the farm, and all their kids took over. The house was a large, typically large family farmhouse. And so everyone who had an interruption in their lives, they had all of these, 11 children? And no, grandmother and grandfather had such a large family. So if there was an interruption in any of their families, then everybody came back to the home farm, because the house was large enough to accommodate us all. And then up on the third floor, there was the hatchery, the professional hatchery. And so I remember, but I have seen some records from the Wood Station School. And according to those records, I only went to school for 2.5 months at the Wood Station School out in the country. So somewhere along the line were we in that, in that situation. I didn't want to leave that out, but I'm not quite sure where it fits in. And another little interim. It wasn't as it is now, a single woman with children whose marriage has been interrupted. She had to make her way. And the little money that she received from, the father for caring for the children, just didn't do all that she had to do. So she did what she had to do. She didn't sit and hold her hands. So that's the reason, I guess, looking back, this was never explained to me. And my mother may not like it if I say it. But I think that may be the reason we moved around so much. But usually with support of family and extended family. Because there was a time when I first came from my father to live with my mother was working in Altamont, Illinois. She was a pianist at the big major, it happened one great big church in the town. And her sister, Sadie Ellis, was married to Charles Ellis, who was from Altamont. The Ellis family was probably the only African-American family originally in Altamont, because by the time I remember, they owned what they called the candy kitchen. You had to wear certain dresses to go to the candy kitchen. That was new for me. I'm used to running down to the corner store and getting some candy. However, and whatever, and he, and also Uncle Charles, his father before him, and his brother, and himself, and Sadie Johnson, my mother's sister, Ellis's husband, they had the only barbershop in town. Well, Mother went because Uncle Charles' father, Grandpa Ellis, we called him, was failing. He was elderly. His wife had died, and he was getting older, so Mother became his housekeeper, and she gave music lessons in the town and played for the church. As I'm saying, I hadn't put that together before, but that's the way it was. The Ellis family was large. There were a lot of, there were a lot of members of that family. They were very prominent people in Chicago, and some people here in Alton may know them. I guess many people know of B. Ellis because she was such a famous person nationally, associated with Duke Ellington and so on and so forth. And I was always jealous of her because she was older, but she got so much more attention. And when we came back to Wood Station, this is a little aside. When we came back to Wood Station, I wanted to ride the horses so badly. Oh, I wanted to ride a horse. Uncle Cyrus didn't allow girls, he and grandfather, didn't allow girls to ride horses. Well, I guess I must have been sort of inclined toward feminism even then, because I really did resent that. And Jewel and Uncle Carlston, who was still young, just a little older than we, and so forth, they would ride the horses, and it just looked like so much fun. I'd want to ride a horse so badly. I never got over that, by the way. I never got over that. But when B came, B could ride the horses, and I had it for her. Now, she was older than I, prettier and more urbane and all this good stuff. But I really did not like B. because she got so many more privileges. And see, I'm kind of a spoiled brat too. From East St. Louis, I'm used to getting privileges. And so, anyway, we later laughed about that, but I really did. That's the only thing, as I'm talking to you, I think that's the only thing I ever had against my Uncle Cyrus Johnson. Really. Because I just loved him so. And all of my life, until his death, I honored him and he honored me. I just know that human beings should not be separated because of racial background. I know that is not right.